A quiet confidence, the unraveling truth. Darius's fingers tightened around his phone, the cool metal of the device grounding him in the moment. The flight attendants stood before him, their expressions unreadable but undoubtedly anticipating some sort of resistance or confrontation. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze bearing down on him. The whispers around the terminal grew louder, and for the first time in a long while, he was aware of how deeply his skin set him apart in a room full of strangers. As he raised the phone to his ear, Darius took a steadying breath, his eyes briefly scanning the faces around him. There was an unease in the air now, a shift. Some passengers had stopped whatever they were doing to watch, their attention fixed firmly on him. A few were exchanging murmured words, likely speculating about what was happening, but Darius knew that for many of them, his experience was just a curiosity, another story to be told in whispers. He wasn't sure if they even understood the gravity of what was unfolding. To them, this was just another drama in an otherwise mundane day of travel. But to Darius, it was a moment of reckoning. A moment that would change everything. The phone rang, the sound cutting through the tension. It was a number he had programmed into his phone years ago, the personal number of his legal counsel, a woman who had been with him since the early days of his rise to prominence. Vanessa Marshall. Her voice was familiar, calm, and efficient, always grounded in clarity. Mr. Montgomery, Vanessa answered on the third ring, her voice a steady anchor amidst the chaos. What can I do for you? Darius's voice was calm but edged with barely contained fury. Vanessa, I need your help. I'm at gate 47, and I've just been publicly humiliated. They tore up my ticket. It's a situation I didn't expect, but they've decided that I don't belong in first class. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Darius could almost hear Vanessa's brow furrow, as though she were absorbing every detail of his words. Then, she spoke. Are you sure about this, Darius? This isn't something to take lightly. You've never had issues with your tickets before. I'm sure, he said, his voice sharp. They've checked my ticket, but they don't believe me. There's no mistake on my end. I need you to make a call. I need you to put the right people in touch with the right people. Vanessa was silent for a moment, perhaps strategizing, formulating her next steps. Darius could almost sense her mind at work, her years of experience, her mastery in corporate maneuvering and legal wrangling. He trusted her with his life, and at that moment, it felt like his life was hanging in the balance, precariously dangling by a thread. I'll call the airline's CEO, Vanessa said finally, her voice determined. Give me a few minutes. Just stay where you are and stay calm. Don't escalate things any further. I'll handle this. Darius nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thank you, Vanessa. I knew I could count on you. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. His eyes met the attendants once again, their faces betraying no emotion. But Darius knew the truth, the moment Vanessa's call reached the top executives at the airline, everything would change. The young flight attendant, who had first questioned his ticket, stepped forward cautiously, as though unsure of how to handle the escalating situation. Sir, I understand this must be frustrating, she began, her voice tinged with a weak attempt at sympathy. But the truth is, your ticket simply isn't valid. Our system doesn't show any booking under your name. Darius could see her nervously glancing around the terminal, likely sensing the discomfort of the other passengers. If you just cooperate, she continued, her words more clipped now, we can resolve this issue and get you rebooked on another flight. The suggestion felt like an insult, as if he had not only been accused of fraud but now expected to sit back and accept the mistreatment. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, but he knew that wasn't the right move. Not yet. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he held on to the calm that had taken him so far in life. I don't need to be rebooked, Darius said, his voice calm but firm. I need you to fix this mistake. Now. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, but neither spoke. They had no idea who they were dealing with. For a brief moment, Darius entertained the thought of revealing his identity. But he quickly dismissed it. Revealing who he was would not fix this. It would only serve to further alienate him from the people around him, from the passengers who were now watching the drama unfold. No, this had to be handled differently. He could see the manager from the gate approaching now, a man in a dark suit who had likely been summoned to assess the situation. The manager's eyes flicked between Darius and the flight attendants before landing on the torn-up ticket scattered on the counter. "What seems to be the issue here?" the manager asked, his voice polite but laced with the authority of someone accustomed to handling customer complaints. "This man," the young attendant began, her voice suddenly louder and more accusatory, "is trying to board a first-class flight with a fraudulent ticket. We've already torn it up, but we're waiting for confirmation that his information is valid." The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise, his gaze now shifting to Darius, as though he were the source of the problem. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the terminal was on them. A few passengers had gathered near the gate, some discreetly filming the altercation on their phones. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, this was a spectacle. Darius took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "I think it's time you made a phone call. You need to verify this. Immediately." The manager looked taken aback by Darius's calm but commanding tone. "We don't usually." "I'm not asking for your permission," Darius interjected smoothly. "I'm telling you to make the call. This isn't a situation you want to escalate." For a long moment, the manager seemed to consider his options. But, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation and the possibility of further embarrassment, he nodded slowly and pulled out his own phone. As he dialed, Darius couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the energy of the room. The other passengers who had been previously amused or curious were now watching with rapt attention, their expressions shifting from intrigue to suspicion. Some seemed to recognize the seriousness of the situation. They were witnessing a battle of power, an unequal confrontation unfolding in front of them. It wasn't long before the manager spoke into the phone, his voice lowered as he relayed the details of the situation. Darius could hear the hushed tone, the attempt to conceal the growing tension, but it didn't take long for the manager to end the call. He looked up, his expression suddenly much less confident. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, his voice now surprisingly apologetic. "It seems we've had a mix-up. The ticket you were given is indeed valid. There was an issue with our system. I am terribly sorry for the inconvenience." Darius held his gaze steady, unwavering. "You're sorry," he repeated softly, but the weight of his words hung in the air. "This isn't just about an inconvenience. This is about respect." The manager didn't respond. Instead, he silently handed Darius a new first-class ticket. There was no apology in his eyes, no remorse, just the acknowledgement that things had escalated further than they ever should have. Darius didn't take the ticket immediately. He simply stared at it, the piece of paper now representing more than just a seat on a plane. It was a symbol of the larger issue, the systemic bias that had led to this moment. "Are you sure it's valid?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. The manager, clearly unsure of how to proceed, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. It is. You have my word." Darius took the ticket from him, but instead of turning to walk away, he paused. He surveyed the crowd once more, feeling the eyes that had once been filled with curiosity now searching for answers. The truth was out there. But it wasn't enough for it to end with just a quiet apology. He knew that this moment, this interaction, was far from over. What came next would change the course of the day, and perhaps even the future. The ripple effect had already begun. The terminal was alive with activity, the vibrant hum of voices, the dull roar of jet engines, and the clinking of luggage wheels over the smooth floors. Passengers bustled around, some with the weight of their own concerns, others lost in the comfort of routine travel. It was a place of transitions, a space where lives were in motion, and every face held a different story. Darius Montgomery, however, was not one to be swept up in the frenzy. As he moved through the crowd, there was an almost deliberate slowness to his gait, as though he had all the time in the world. His well-tailored khakis brushed the polished floor as he approached the gate, blending into the chaos like a seasoned traveler who had long ago learned the art of invisibility. At 58, Darius was the embodiment of quiet confidence. A tall man, his broad shoulders and dignified posture spoke of years spent leading with purpose, of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His hair, flecked with silver, added to his air of wisdom and authority, yet his expression was calm, his eyes observant but unruffled. He had worked hard to get to this point. He was not some careless rookie in the world of high society. He was a CEO, a business magnate, a man whose name carried weight. But even with all his achievements, there was a part of him that still clung to the memory of his beginnings. The memory of the small hardware store where he had spent his teenage years, sweeping the floors and stocking shelves, wondering if the world would ever see him for more than his skin color. Back then, people saw a young black man with little to his name, a man destined to stay on the periphery. But Darius knew better. He had never accepted the limitations that others tried to place on him. No, he had worked tirelessly to redefine what was possible. And now, as he stood in this airport, his hands wrapped around his first-class ticket, he was reminded of just how far he had come. The ticket was a symbol of his success, but not just of the material wealth he had acquired. No, it represented the blood, sweat, and tears that had built an empire, a legacy. He reached the counter and presented his ticket to the young attendant, who greeted him with a smile that seemed to falter the moment she glanced at the document. The smile that had been warm and inviting just moments ago quickly became strained. Darius didn't miss the subtle shift in her demeanor. "First-class boarding?" she asked, her voice tinged with a note of doubt. "Yes," he answered simply, his tone even, devoid of any defensiveness. There was no need for him to explain himself. His achievements spoke for him. She glanced at the ticket again, her brow furrowing. Then, without warning, she handed the ticket to a colleague nearby, who studied it in silence. The hum of the terminal seemed to fade into the background, and for a fleeting moment, Darius felt the eyes of others on him. He remained calm, his posture still upright, his face impassive, but inside, a small flicker of unease ignited. What was going on? He'd been through countless check-ins, boarding processes, and security checks in his time as a businessman, and he'd never faced a situation like this. Why was she questioning his ticket? What was happening here? He had heard stories, of course, stories about discrimination, about people being judged based on the color of their skin rather than the validity of their purchases, their choices, or their very identity. But Darius never expected it to happen to him, not here, not now, and certainly not at a time when he had worked so hard to reach this point. "Sir," the attendant said, interrupting his thoughts. "I'm afraid there's an issue with your ticket." Darius blinked, taken aback. "An issue? What do you mean?" The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "I'm going to have to check with my supervisor. Please wait here." Before Darius could say another word, she was gone, disappearing behind the security gates that separated the passengers from the boarding area. He stood there, his mind racing. What was happening? Was this a mistake? He was no stranger to these situations, where people of color were scrutinized more than others. But to have it happen now, in this way, in front of so many people, it was almost surreal. He glanced around the bustling terminal, noticing the few curious glances that came his way. Some people seemed to be whispering, and others had that look, subtle but unmistakable, that he was somehow out of place. His mind raced through all the possibilities. Was this some sort of misunderstanding? Or had he been singled out? There was no way to know for sure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. A few minutes passed in tense silence before the attendant returned, this time with a stern expression and a different flight attendant in tow. The new woman was older, her expression cold and clinical, as though she had dealt with difficult situations like this before. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her tone formal, but with an undercurrent of authority, "I'm afraid your ticket does not match our system records. It appears to be invalid." Darius's heart sank. He knew this wasn't true. He had personally arranged for this flight through his company's travel coordinator. There was no mistake. He had always been diligent about ensuring that everything was in order, especially for something as important as a business trip. And yet, here he was, being questioned in front of a crowd of passengers, some of whom were now eyeing him with increasing curiosity. "With all due respect," Darius began, his voice calm yet firm, "I assure you that this ticket is valid. I've flown with your airline countless times before, and I have never encountered an issue like this." The older attendant didn't seem to care for his calm demeanor. Instead, she glanced at her colleague, who nodded slightly before turning her attention back to Darius. "I'm afraid the situation is out of our hands," the attendant said, her words dripping with condescension. "If you'd like, we can escort you to the customer service desk to resolve the issue. But for now, you cannot board this flight." Before Darius could respond, she reached for his ticket once more. But this time, instead of attempting to investigate further, she simply tore the ticket in half, her fingers ripping through the paper with a decisive motion. The sharp sound of the paper splitting in two echoed through the terminal, and the atmosphere shifted. Darius's breath caught in his chest as the crowd around him seemed to hold its collective breath. There it was. The ultimate insult. The degradation of his very existence, torn apart with a single motion. His mind swirled with emotions, anger, confusion, frustration, but Darius fought to remain composed. He couldn't afford to lose his temper, not here, not in front of so many people. But the humiliation, the public rejection, the clear disdain with which they treated him, it was too much. For a brief moment, the terminal seemed to shrink around him. The other passengers, once distant figures, were now all too close, their eyes boring into him with varying degrees of curiosity, judgment, and surprise. Darius's pulse quickened. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, a cocktail of disbelief and rage. But, through the fog of anger, he held on to one truth: this was not the end. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. The question was, how would it unfold? He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but in truth, it had only been a few moments. The flight attendants waited expectantly, clearly expecting him to leave. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Darius reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he knew all too well. The number of someone who would make all of this disappear with a single phone call. The power of silence. The hum of the terminal seemed to quiet, as if the airport itself had held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Darius stood at the gate, his fingers curling around the new ticket, a small piece of paper that seemed to weigh far more than it should. In a way, it was a victory, but it was also an uneasy reminder of the battle he had just fought. He had won this round, but there was a sense that the war was far from over. He didn't immediately board the plane. Instead, Darius stood there for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the terminal, watching the expressions of the people around him. A few were still filming discreetly, capturing the scene as though it were a reality show, an act of public humiliation played out in real time. Others were engaged in hushed conversations, exchanging looks, their faces a mixture of disbelief and something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps shame, or perhaps the uneasy understanding that what they had witnessed wasn't just a moment of personal indignity but something far more insidious. But there was one thing Darius knew for certain. In a moment like this, silence could be just as powerful as words. The crowd had assumed that his experience was an isolated incident, a single misunderstanding, a moment of human error. But Darius understood the undercurrents beneath the surface. He knew that what had just happened was not merely about a mistaken ticket, it was about the assumptions people made based on his appearance. It was about the deeply ingrained prejudice that still existed in the world, whether people admitted it or not. As the minutes ticked by, Darius's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the gate's door sliding open. The flight attendants had gone inside, likely to prepare for the boarding process. But he had no intention of walking onto that plane just yet. Darius turned to face the crowd that had gathered. His gaze swept across the room, meeting eyes with several passengers who had been watching. There was a shift in the air, a subtle acknowledgement that this wasn't just an inconvenience but something much larger. Some looked away, unsure of what to do with the truth. Others met his eyes with something that bordered on apology, as though they knew, deep down, what had just unfolded wasn't just an unfortunate mistake, it was a glaring reminder of the biases that persisted in society. A few seconds later, the gate agent approached Darius again, but this time, she moved with a different air about her, more cautious, less sure of herself. She stood before him, her posture stiff, as if preparing herself for something unexpected. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, her voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, again. I'm sorry for the trouble earlier. The situation was a misunderstanding." Darius remained silent, watching her closely. There was something about her apology that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the apology itself. It was the way it was offered, hollow, mechanical, as though she had been trained to say the right words but hadn't truly come to terms with the gravity of her actions. "Thank you," he said, his tone calm, though every word felt measured, deliberate. "But you're wrong about one thing." The attendant looked at him, confused. "Your apology," Darius continued, his eyes not leaving hers, "isn't enough." Her eyes flickered nervously. I don't understand, sir. I thought." "No," Darius interrupted, his voice steady and composed. "You don't understand. You don't understand the implications of what just happened. You don't understand that this wasn't just about a ticket. You don't understand that you just assumed that because of how I look, I didn't belong. You don't understand that for many of us, this is not a mistake, it's a pattern." The attendant opened her mouth to respond, but Darius held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. "I'm not angry at you, personally," he said, his tone shifting slightly to one of quiet reflection. "I don't know you. I'm not interested in attacking you or berating you. But I do need you to understand something, this isn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue. It's part of the system that makes assumptions about people based on the color of their skin, based on their appearance. And you, my dear, are part of that system." Her face paled as his words sank in, the reality of the situation settling into her consciousness. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Darius took a step back, his hand resting lightly on his ticket. "I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here because I want you to realize what just happened. This moment is not just about me. It's about everyone who has been pushed aside or made to feel small because of the way they look. This is a moment to reflect, not just for you but for everyone who watched and did nothing." He turned to the side, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the passengers once again. "You can't change the past. But we have the power to change what happens next." As he spoke, Darius didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture wildly to make his point. He simply let the weight of his words land in the silence that had settled over the terminal. For a long moment, there was nothing but quiet. The kind of quiet that speaks volumes. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to respond. The gate attendants stood frozen, unsure of what to do with this confrontation. And Darius stood there, steady and resolute, letting the silence do the talking for him. He didn't need to explain further. He knew that what he had said had been heard. The tension in the air was palpable, the reality of what had transpired settling like dust on a long-forgotten road. People who had once watched with curiosity were now reflecting. Some were likely thinking back to their own interactions, to the times they had witnessed or perpetuated small acts of bias without even realizing it. Others, perhaps, were simply trying to reconcile the image of Darius standing before them with the preconceptions they had once held. Either way, the impact was undeniable. Finally, the gate agent cleared her throat, the sound breaking the stillness like a distant thunderclap. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice quieter now, her earlier arrogance gone. "I truly am sorry for what happened today. I understand what you mean." Darius nodded but said nothing more. He didn't need her to understand in that moment. What mattered was that this was the beginning. This was the moment when people stopped being passive observers and began to recognize the truth. It wasn't enough for him to walk away from this unscathed, he wanted something to change. And it was clear that the moment had arrived for something to shift in the way this world worked. Turning on his heel, Darius made his way toward the boarding gate. But just before stepping through the door, he paused. He glanced back one last time at the gate agent and the surrounding crowd. "Remember this," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The real power isn't in tearing up someone's ticket. It's in standing up for what's right, no matter who's watching." With that, Darius Montgomery boarded his flight, a quiet confidence carrying him forward into the unknown, knowing that what had just occurred wasn't just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a much larger movement, a shift that would ripple through the lives of everyone who had witnessed this moment. And the ripples had only just begun. The ripple effect. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Darius sat back in his first-class seat, the soft hum of the engines vibrating through the cabin. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic sounds of the flight soothe his mind, but he couldn't shake the events that had just unfolded. The confrontation at the gate replayed in his mind like a loop, each moment more vivid than the last. The young flight attendant's accusatory tone. The crowd's uneasy silence. The manager's apologetic expression. It had all been so sudden, so unexpected, yet it felt like something that had been brewing for far longer. Darius had known that this moment would come. He had known that there would be times when his success, his very existence in spaces that were once closed to him, would be questioned. He had felt the sting of doubt in the eyes of others before, but today, it had been more blatant. More public. And, in a strange way, that had made it all the more powerful. But it wasn't just about what had happened at the gate. It wasn't even about the airline or the flight attendants. What had transpired that day was part of a much larger conversation, a conversation that had been going on for centuries, whether people wanted to admit it or not. A conversation about race, identity, and the assumptions people made based on appearances. Darius thought back to his early years, when he had worked tirelessly to build the life he now had. He remembered the long hours spent in his father's hardware store, the calluses on his hands, the sweat dripping down his back as he worked alongside his father, learning the value of hard work and perseverance. Those years had been defined by struggle, by sacrifice, and by a deep belief that one day, he would rise above it all. But even now, as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, that struggle hadn't completely disappeared. The memories of his humble beginnings had shaped him, molded him into the man he was today, but they hadn't shielded him from the harsh realities of the world. No matter how much success he achieved, there would always be those who questioned his place in the room. There would always be someone who would look at him and wonder if he truly belonged. As the plane ascended into the sky, Darius let out a long, steady breath. He knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. His experience was far from unique. It was shared by countless individuals who had been forced to prove their worth time and time again, who had been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. But it was in these moments like today, that the real change could happen. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a symbol. A representation of the possibilities that could emerge when people defied the odds and broke through the barriers that society had placed in their path. He had worked hard to get to where he was, but that hard work didn't shield him from the prejudices that lingered in the world. If anything, it made him a target. And that was something he would never back down from. But for now, as the plane cruised through the clouds, Darius allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had done what he needed to do. He had made his point, not just to the flight attendants or the passengers who had witnessed the scene, but to himself. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had reaffirmed his commitment to challenging the status quo. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. What Darius didn't know, however, was that his actions were already beginning to spark a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences, far beyond the confines of the airport and the flight he was on. Back at the airport, the ripple effect had already begun. People who had witnessed the confrontation were sharing their stories online, posting videos and recounting the events on social media. It wasn't long before the story began to spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #StandUpForWhatIsRight and #RacialBiasInTheSkies began trending, with thousands of people adding their voices to the conversation. The incident had sparked a firestorm of debate, with people from all walks of life weighing in on the issue of racial bias and the treatment of black people in spaces traditionally dominated by others. For some, the incident was a stark reminder of the everyday racism that still pervaded society. For others, it was a call to action, an opportunity to confront these issues head-on and demand change. And for a few, it was a wake-up call, a moment of reflection that forced them to reconsider their own assumptions and biases. But there was one group in particular that took immediate notice of the story. The senior executives at the airline. The moment the video went viral, they were inundated with messages, complaints, and calls from customers who were outraged by the treatment of a paying passenger. The company's reputation was at stake, and the pressure to respond was immense. Within hours of the incident, the airline's PR team sprang into action, crafting a statement of apology. It was a carefully worded statement, full of corporate jargon, promising to investigate the situation and ensure that such an incident would never happen again. But Darius knew better. He knew that apologies were easy, but real change required action. It required a shift in the way the company viewed its customers and its employees. It required a deeper understanding of the systemic issues that had led to this moment. But the statement, while well-intentioned, wasn't enough. The backlash continued to grow, with calls for boycotts of the airline flooding social media. The story was being shared and discussed in boardrooms, in living rooms, and across dinner tables. It was clear that something had to change, and it had to change fast. In the weeks that followed, the airline began to feel the weight of the public's demands. They started implementing new diversity and inclusion initiatives, launching sensitivity training for their staff, and appointing a new team of executives focused on improving the company's relationship with its customers, particularly people of color. But Darius wasn't satisfied with just an apology. He knew that real change didn't happen through corporate initiatives alone. He had spent his entire life fighting to break down barriers, and now, he had the platform to do something more meaningful. He had the power to push for systemic change in a way that few others could. The incident at the airport had sparked something deep within him. He was no longer content with just being the CEO of his company. He wanted to use his position to challenge the systems that had kept people like him from reaching their full potential. He wanted to be a catalyst for change, not just in his industry, but in society at large. And so, Darius made a decision. He would use the platform that his success had afforded him to lead the charge for greater racial equity and inclusion. It was time to take the lessons he had learned. The resilience, the perseverance, the understanding of what it meant to rise above, and apply them to something larger than himself. He would begin by calling for an industry-wide summit on racial bias in the travel and aviation sector. He would gather leaders from across the industry, airlines, airports, travel agencies, and advocacy groups, and demand that they work together to create a more inclusive and equitable environment for all travelers. It was a bold move, but Darius knew it was the right one. As he prepared to launch the initiative, Darius couldn't help but think back to that moment at the gate, the moment when he had been publicly humiliated. That moment had been painful, yes, but it had also been a defining moment. It had crystallized everything he had been fighting for and given him the clarity he needed to take his mission to the next level. The plane continued its journey across the sky, but Darius's mind was already focused on the future. The battle he had just fought was only the beginning. The real work was yet to come. The catalyst for change. As the days passed, the fallout from the airport incident continued to grow. Darius Montgomery's name was on the lips of everyone, journalists, activists, and everyday people who had witnessed the moment unfold. The video of his confrontation with the flight attendant had gone viral, becoming a symbol of the systemic racism that still plagued so many aspects of life. But while the public debate raged on, Darius's thoughts had shifted to something deeper. He knew that his actions at the airport, though powerful in the moment, were just the beginning. The media frenzy would eventually die down, and the attention would shift to something else. He needed to ensure that the momentum didn't fade away with the headlines. He needed to channel the public outrage into something concrete, something lasting. Darius's first step in this new journey was to launch a movement that would go beyond social media hashtags. He began reaching out to influential leaders in the business and social justice communities, hoping to build a coalition that would work toward addressing the deep-seated racial inequities in corporate environments, particularly in the travel industry. It wasn't long before he had assembled a team of diverse thinkers, executives, activists, educators, and cultural commentators, who all shared the belief that meaningful change required collaboration and strategic action. Together, they began to formulate a plan. They weren't just focused on the airline industry, they wanted to create a ripple effect that could be felt across all sectors: retail, hospitality, entertainment, and beyond. They started by drafting a comprehensive proposal for what they were calling the Equality in Travel Initiative, ETI. The initiative aimed to address racial discrimination in the travel industry through a multi-pronged approach. First and foremost, it called for the creation of mandatory sensitivity and cultural competence training for all employees at airlines, airports, and related businesses. This wasn't just about teaching people how to be polite, it was about dismantling the deep-rooted biases that shaped their interactions with customers. The second pillar of the ETI focused on accountability. Airlines and other travel companies were asked to adopt transparent policies regarding incidents of racial discrimination. This meant that when a complaint was filed, there would be a thorough investigation, and the company would take concrete steps to prevent it from happening again. Darius insisted on an independent review board, composed of both industry professionals and civil rights leaders, to ensure that the process was fair and unbiased. The third component of the initiative was the establishment of scholarships and mentorship programs for Black and other underrepresented minorities who wanted to pursue careers in aviation, hospitality, and travel. Darius knew from his own experiences that access to opportunity was one of the most significant barriers to progress. If the travel industry truly wanted to diversify, they needed to invest in the next generation of leaders. The final, and perhaps most ambitious, part of the ETI was to create a nationwide public awareness campaign that would educate the public about the subtle ways racial bias played out in everyday interactions. It wasn't enough to change the internal workings of the travel industry if the public's mindset remained unchanged. The campaign would leverage the power of storytelling, using real-life examples, to illustrate the impact of racial discrimination and its consequences. But Darius wasn't just going to push for change behind the scenes. He knew that real progress would come from sustained public pressure, and he was more than willing to put himself at the forefront of the movement. He began giving speeches at major conferences, appearing on talk shows, and writing op-eds in prominent publications. He spoke passionately about the need to reimagine what it meant to be an ally in the fight for racial equity. His voice was becoming increasingly influential, and with each platform he stepped onto, the call for action grew louder. Darius's initiative was gaining traction. Industry leaders who had once been hesitant to address these issues were now listening. The media, too, was beginning to take notice, not just of the incident at the airport but of Darius's broader vision for systemic change. Some questioned whether this was all just a publicity stunt, but Darius was steadfast in his commitment to the cause. He wasn't doing this for accolades or recognition, he was doing it because he believed that if there was a chance to make a meaningful impact, he had to take it. But as Darius's profile grew, so did the opposition. There were many who didn't want to see change. These were the people who believed that the status quo was fine, that progress had already been made, and that the conversation about race had gone on long enough. They argued that the focus should be on merit and hard work, not race. They attacked Darius personally, calling him divisive and accusing him of playing the race card. These voices were loud, and their influence was felt in boardrooms across the country. One particular interview on a popular news network set the stage for a fierce debate. Darius was invited onto a primetime show to discuss the ETI and the viral incident at the airport. The host, known for his conservative views, opened the segment by questioning Darius's credibility. "Mr. Montgomery," the host said, "you've been very vocal about your experiences with racial discrimination, but many people are asking, why now? Why are you making this about race when, clearly, you've achieved so much in your life?" Darius was calm, his voice steady as he responded. "Because it's always been about race. The difference is, now people are listening. For years, people like me have been told that our success is an exception, not the rule. That's not the case. I'm not an exception. I'm just one of many who have fought to break through barriers. But the fact that my story is still being debated shows that the barriers are still there." The host scoffed. "So, what you're saying is that every time someone disagrees with you, it's because of racism?" Darius's eyes sharpened, but his tone remained even. "No, I'm saying that when people disagree with you without understanding the context of your life, it's because they haven't taken the time to learn what it's like to walk in your shoes. It's easy to dismiss a problem you don't experience. But that doesn't mean it's not real. We've all heard the argument that racism doesn't exist in America anymore, but that's not true. It's there, in subtle ways, in everyday interactions." The tension in the room was palpable. The host tried to push back, but Darius's unwavering stance made it clear that he wasn't backing down. By the time the interview ended, the public response was immediate. His supporters rallied behind him, praising his calm yet powerful defense of the movement. But his critics, too, were vocal, accusing him of oversimplifying complex issues and calling for divisive policies. The public battle was far from over, but for Darius, it was only another step in the fight he had committed himself to. He was undeterred by the criticism because he knew the road ahead would be long, and change would not come easily. But he also knew this: the conversation had changed. People were no longer silent. They were talking, debating, and questioning. And that was where real change began. As the weeks passed, the ETI gained more and more support. Airlines began to adopt some of the recommended policies, and Darius received invitations to speak at other industry conferences and forums. The momentum was building, but the work was just beginning. For Darius Montgomery, the journey wasn't about winning a single battle, it was about fighting for a future where the assumptions made about a person's worth would be based on their character and achievements, not the color of their skin. And as he continued his fight, Darius was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the seeds of change had already been planted. A legacy of change. The months following the launch of the Equality in Travel initiative were a blur of meetings, speeches, and public appearances. Darius Montgomery had become not just a figurehead for the movement, but a symbol of perseverance and change. His name was now synonymous with the fight against racial bias in the travel industry, but it was the behind-the-scenes work that truly defined his impact. The boardrooms that had once felt intimidating to him, rooms filled with executives who had often looked at him with skepticism, had started to feel like spaces where his voice mattered. Darius wasn't just advocating for himself anymore. He was advocating for those who didn't have the same platform, the same visibility. For those who had been silenced or overlooked. The first major breakthrough came when one of the world's largest airlines, Horizon Airways, announced that they would be adopting the majority of the proposals put forth by the ETI. It was a monumental step, one that Darius had known would take time to achieve. But the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion signaled that things were beginning to shift. Other airlines followed suit, some with more hesitance, others more eager to embrace change. But it wasn't just the airlines that began to take note. Airports, travel agencies, even ride-sharing companies, entities that had long been blind to the racial dynamics within their own operations, started revisiting their policies and practices. Sensitivity training, once viewed as a token gesture, was now seen as a vital step toward addressing the unconscious biases that influenced the way customers were treated. But Darius knew that the true test would be whether these changes stuck. Companies could issue statements, implement new training programs, and host public forums, but if the hearts and minds of the people working in these industries didn't change, none of it would matter. True transformation required more than surface-level changes, it required a shift in perspective. Darius continued to push forward, knowing that he had not just a professional duty to uphold, but a moral one. He used his platform to create spaces where people could have uncomfortable conversations about race, privilege, and bias. He brought together thought leaders from different sectors to talk about how these issues impacted not just the travel industry but society at large. But for all his success, for all the accolades and praise he received, there were still moments when Darius felt the weight of the work ahead. The public pushback never fully disappeared. The same voices that had criticized him in the early days continued to attack him in the media, questioning his motives and accusing him of seeking to divide the country. They weren't interested in hearing his message, they were too invested in maintaining the status quo. Darius knew that to make real change, he had to fight these voices with patience. He couldn't win every battle through confrontation. Sometimes, the most powerful act was to keep going, to outlast the criticism with grace and persistence. But he also understood that sometimes the system itself needed a nudge. And that's exactly what he was doing. One evening, as Darius sat at his desk, reviewing the latest updates from his team, he received a call from an unexpected source. It was a message from the flight attendant, the same one who had torn up his ticket months earlier. Her voice, though tinged with regret, was sincere. "Mr. Montgomery, I've been following your work. I want to apologize for how I treated you that day at the airport. I had no idea who you were, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how wrong I was. I've been working with the airline to learn more about racial biases, and I wanted to personally reach out. I hope you can forgive me." Darius was silent for a moment, processing her words. He knew that this apology, genuine as it was a reflection of the broader cultural shift that had been set in motion. She wasn't the only one who had been forced to confront her biases. The entire world had been doing the same. And while his own personal experience had been painful, it was also part of a larger, collective awakening. "I appreciate your apology," Darius finally replied, his voice calm but firm. But real change doesn't happen with a single apology. It takes a commitment to learning, to understanding, and to acting in a way that reflects that growth every day. I hope that you, and everyone else, will continue to challenge yourselves. The conversation ended on a note of mutual respect. Darius didn't hold a grudge, but he also didn't let the moment pass without reinforcing the importance of long-term commitment to change. Meanwhile, Darius's personal life had evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. As much as he poured himself into his work, he knew he couldn't do it all alone. He began building a network of people who shared his vision, individuals who would continue the work long after he was gone. He became an unofficial mentor to several young leaders, people from all walks of life who were just beginning their careers in business, politics, and activism. They, in turn, taught him just as much as he taught them. The airline industry, for all its flaws, had been changed by the force of Darius's will. But that wasn't where his efforts stopped. He started shifting his focus to education, believing that if children were taught the importance of empathy, diversity, and inclusion from an early age, the world would be a far different place when they grew up. He created scholarships for students who showed a passion for equity and social justice, and through partnerships with schools and nonprofits, he made sure those scholarships went to young people from underserved communities. Darius's company, Montgomery Enterprises, also became a beacon for diversity in the corporate world. He implemented practices that ensured people of all backgrounds had a seat at the table and were given opportunities to grow. It wasn't enough to just hire diverse employees. Darius was committed to ensuring that they had a real stake in the future of the company. He worked to create an environment where creativity and innovation could thrive, regardless of who you were or where you came from. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, Darius reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the young man he had once been. The one scrubbing floors in his father's hardware store, unsure of what the future would hold. He had come so far. And yet, there was still work to be done. As he gazed out the window, he could hear the quiet hum of the city below. It was a sound that had once been distant, almost foreign to him. But now, it felt like a sign. A sign that the work was far from over, that the journey was still in progress. And just as he had once risen from nothing to become a leader in his industry, he knew that the world could rise with him. The flight attendant who had once humiliated him at the gate was a reminder of the obstacles Darius had faced. But the change they had sparked together, the conversations, the policies, the personal transformations, was a testament to how far they had come. The world was still full of challenges, but now there were more people willing to fight for what was right, and that made all the difference. As the night deepened, Darius smiled quietly to himself. There would be more battles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. And that, he knew, was the true measure of progress.